Okay, this tutorial is on the slave trade in the colonies, part 1. And I guess the first thing that I want to bring up about this is that I don't feel like we're spending anywhere near as much time as we need to be on this topic. Um, Again, this is a survey course, and it means you've got to get to a certain place by a certain time. And there are plenty of stops I would like to make along the way to look around and take a much closer examination of slavery and the role it played in early America. Unfortunately, we are held by time constraints. So if it's something that you want to take a look at a little bit more on your own, I would highly suggest it. So anyway, let's start with this. The origins of the slave trade in the colonies in the first place. I mean, where did it come from? It turned into this major institution. So how did it become what it eventually became? Where did this all start? Well, as far as we know, the very first African slaves arrived in the New World in 1619 off the coast of Virginia. There were approximately 20 sold from a Dutch warship off the coast of Jamestown. And initially, it seemed like very humble beginnings to something that would boom into a major part of American history, both culturally, politically, economically, in significant areas across the board. But again, though, this marked small beginnings. African slaves were very, very expensive. So over the first 30 years after their initial appearance, very few were purchased. We saw the first ones here in 1619 in Jamestown, about roughly 12 years after Jamestown was initially settled, and there really weren't very many. By 1650, almost half a century later after the founding of Jamestown, there would only be 300 Africans total in the Virginia colony. So it didn't boom right away. Something had to cause this to happen. It's as crude as this is to say, it's simple supply and demand. There had to be a demand for African labor, and it wasn't there yet in the initial parts. Still, one slave is one slave too many. But in terms of studying why this happened, it took something much bigger to cause the boom in the slave trade. That boom would take place in the Caribbean. If you remember, this is also referred to as the Dutch West Indies. The big difference in the Caribbean as opposed to Virginia is that Virginians were planting tobacco, which was considered to be a poor man's crop. It didn't require a lot of labor, and therefore there was not a massive demand for a labor force in Virginia. By 1670, there would only be 2,000 Africans total in Virginia itself, a full 63 years after the founding of Jamestown. So again, one slave is one slave too many, but it wasn't like the population in the slave trade was booming the way we saw it boom later on in Virginia. However, down here, if you look at this slide, England claimed the former Spanish lands in the West Indies and from the Dutch, also known as the Caribbean, where sugar was king. Jamaica especially was considered to be a major prize. It was a place where back in 1655 when they got a hold of it, these dates here indicate when they became independent. But when they got a hold of Jamaica, it was considered to be kind of the crown jewel of sugar producing. Why was sugar producing so significant? Well, unlike tobacco, sugar was considered to be a rich man's crop. Tobacco, remember, it did not need a lot of labor to grow it, so it didn't require slaves. It was easy to grow. But again, the climate in the Caribbean or the West Indies allowed for sugar. Now, sugar had to be planted extensively to get enough sugar to sell, and the overhead costs of producing sugar and refining sugar were really expensive. It required a large labor force to clear land and also to refine the sugar at sugar mills, which was very difficult and a very slow process because you needed to plant so extensively. You had to plant so much acreage of sugar, and you had to hire so much labor to clear that extensive land, and it was such a slow process where time was scarce and you had to pay for that as well at the mills. Sugar production was very, very expensive. And therefore, approximately 250,000 slaves would be sold to the Caribbean or the West Indies sugar plantations between 1640 and 1690. It is sugar, not tobacco, that actually creates the slave boom in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, by 1670, there were only 2,000 Africans in Virginia, but there were 250,000 slaves sold in the Caribbean between 1640 and 1690. By 1700, Africans in the Caribbean would outnumber whites 4-1. And frankly, it's still this way today. If you go to the Caribbean, you're going to find a lot larger African American, or African Caribbean, I guess you'd say, population than you would say in terms of a white population there. But having so many slaves in the Caribbean led to really one of the most unfortunate laws ever passed. Now remember, in Virginia, comparatively to the Caribbean, there weren't as many slaves. In the Caribbean, with so many, well, you know, each one of them has real human emotions and real human desires and needs for freedom and possibly rebellion. And so slave owners in the West Indies came up with the Barbados Slave Code, which was a set of laws designed to control the increasing slave population. The original Barbados Slave Code was created in 1661. The Barbados Slave Code was exceptionally harsh, with vicious punishments. Essentially, what it meant was that slave owners could do anything they wanted to their slaves without fear of reprisal. The only thing that slave owners were required to do was basically to provide them with clothing, which, as you can imagine, they would do the least amount of clothing of the slaves as possible, just because they wanted to save on the money for clothes that they were putting on them. So Africans were dressed in scraps, and really the wording of the Barbados Slave Code allowed owners to do anything they wanted to, anything from rape to whippings to mutilations of other sorts, burning people, burning them alive until they died, or other methods of killing them. It could lead to everything from sexual abuse to physical abuse to mutilation to death. And as long as they were putting clothes on them, somewhat, the slave owners had nothing to fear under the Barbados Slave Code. Eventually, the smaller sugar farms in the West Indies would face another problem. They would get crowded out by sugar barons. There were some that got very wealthy off the sugar trade down there and were buying up the land around them, and they were crowding out the smaller sugar farmers. So many of those smaller sugar farmers headed north to the English colonies in North America, and they brought their knowledge of the slave system with them, including their knowledge of the Barbados Slave Code. As a result, in 1670, the first group of migrating English landed in the Carolina colony with a few slaves and also with their knowledge of the Barbados Slave Code. The result of that would be that Carolina would officially adopt the Barbados Slave Code in 1696. And starting in the Carolina colony, slavery would soon become widespread. Now, eventually, these feelings of rebellion would take shape in actual rebellions that were taking place. One of the first most notable ones, and this is big for the AP U.S. History test, is Bacon's Rebellion. In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, an English planter, would lead a farmers' rebellion against Virginia Governor William Berkeley right here. Now, this really had nothing to do with slaves yet, and if you're not careful, Bacon's Rebellion can be very confusing. A lot of people think that Bacon was a slave. Bacon was not. Bacon was an English planter. So how slaves come into this is fairly intriguing. Essentially, the rebels being led by Bacon were not slaves. They were farmers who had been forced into the frontier in Virginia to find decent land to farm on, primarily because, just like in the Caribbean, aristocratic landowners were gaining more and more territory, so the smaller farmers were forced out into the frontier. Well, they rebelled, and this led to many problems with Native Americans. Governor Berkeley favored Native Americans due to a profitable fur trade that he had with them, and a lot of the Native Americans, under the, some would say under the direction of Berkeley, attacked a lot of the frontier settlements. So you have a lot of these landowners that have been pushed out on the frontier by aristocratic landowners. Native Americans attack them, and because Berkeley had a favorable fur trade with a lot of the Native American tribes, he refused to protect the settlers, the frontier settlers that were out there. He didn't protect the farmers who were getting attacked by Native Americans. And so the farmers decided that they're going to rebel against Berkeley. The farmers then also decided to murder the Native Americans and torch and plunder and pillage Jamestown itself, which chased Berkeley out of town in the process. The farmers essentially said, listen, we've been the ones that are forced out here. We're getting attacked by Native American tribes. You won't help us because you have a fur trade with them, so we're going to kill off the Native Americans ourselves, burn Jamestown, where the governor was, and chase the governor out so we can have control of the region. Now, Bacon would eventually die of disease during this, we'll call it a civil war, a war among civilians of a country. But then Berkeley would then come back and crush the rebellion and hang 20 of the rebels. But again, what does this have to do with slavery? Well, Bacon's rebellion had a lot of effects to it. Because Berkeley had come back and hanged the rebels and crushed the rebellion, former indentured servants, people who had worked the land for wealthy aristocrats more near the coastline and had been pushed out into the frontier now, well, they saw what happened and it upset them. And so wealthy landowners, including Governor Berkeley, were fearing continued rebellions after Bacon's rebellion. They thought that indentured servants might rebel against them. Even the indentured servants that were still working for aristocratic landowners as well, not just former ones, but current ones. So you have a labor force and indentured servants that are very upset about Bacon's rebellion and what happened to the rebels and are considering rebelling themselves. And you have a group of landowners who are fearing that rebellion. So the wealthy ultimately wanted to cut their losses and let the indentured servants go free, but that meant that they were going to need another labor force, one that they could more easily control. And the solution to that problem, unfortunately, would be slavery. And that is how Bacon's rebellion eventually led to an increase in the slave trade in the colonies. Okay, that's it for part one. Thanks for listening.